Chapter 3.3 Resistance, Crisis, Transformation. From Empire, by Michael Hardt and Antonio Negri. Quote, "The continuity of struggle is easy. The workers need only themselves and the boss in front of them. But the continuity of organization is a rare and complex thing. As soon as it is institutionalized, it quickly becomes used by capitalism, or by the workers' movement in the service of capitalism." End quote by Mario Tronti. Quote, "The new left sprang from Elvis's gyrating pelvis." End quote by Jerry Rubin. Earlier he posed the Vietnam War as a deviation from the U.S. constitutional project and its tendency toward empire. The war was also, however, an expression of the desire for freedom of the Vietnamese, an expression of peasant and proletarian subjectivity, a fundamental example of resistance against both the final forms of imperialism and the international disciplinary regime. The Vietnam War represents a real turning point in the history of contemporary capitalism, insofar as the Vietnamese resistance is conceived as a symbolic center of a whole series of struggles around the world that had, up until that point, remained separate and distant from one another. The peasantry who were being subsumed under multinational capital, the post-colonial proletariat, the industrial working class in the dominant capitalist countries, and the new strata of intellectual proletariat everywhere all tended toward a common site of exploitation in the factory society of the globalized, disciplinary regime. The various struggles converged against one common enemy, the international disciplinary order. An objective unity was established, sometimes with the consciousness of those in struggle and sometimes without. The long cycle of struggles against the disciplinary regimes had reached maturity and forced capital to modify its own structures and undergo a paradigm shift. 2, 3, many Vietnams. In the late 1960s, the international system of capitalist production was in crisis. Capitalist crisis, as Marx tells us, is a situation that requires capital to undergo a general devaluation and a profound rearrangement of the relations of production as a result of the downward pressure that the proletariat puts on the rate of profit. In other words, capitalist crisis is not simply a function of capital's own dynamics, but is caused directly by proletarian conflict. This Marxian notion of crisis helps bring to light the most important feature of the crisis in the late 1960s. The fall of the rate of profit and the disruption of relations of command in this period are best understood when seen as a result of the confluence and accumulation of proletarian and anti-capitalist attacks against the international capitalist system. In the dominant capitalist countries, this period witnessed a worker attack of the highest intensity directed primarily against the disciplinary regimes of capitalist labor. The attack was expressed, first of all, as a general refusal of work, and specifically as a refusal of factory work. It was aimed against productivity and against any model of development based on increasing the productivity of factory labor. The refusal of the disciplinary regime and the affirmation of the sphere of non-work became the defining features of a new set of collective practices and a new form of life. Second, the attack served to subvert the capitalist divisions of the labor market. The three primary characteristics of the labor market, the separation of social groups by class strata, race, ethnicity, or sex, the fluidity of the labor market, social mobility, tertiarization, new relations between directly and indirectly productive labor, and so forth, the hierarchies of the market of abstract labor, were all threatened by the rising rigidity and commonality of worker demands. The increasing socialization of capital led also toward the social unification of the proletariat. This increasingly unified voice poised a general demand for a guaranteed social wage and a very high level of welfare. Third, and finally, the worker attack was waged directly against capitalist command. The refusal of work and the social unification of the proletariat came together in a frontal attack against the coercive organization of social labor and the disciplinary structures of command. This worker attack was completely political, even when many mass practices, particularly of youth, seemed decidedly apolitical, insofar as it exposed and struck the political nerve centers of the economic organization of capital. The peasant and proletarian struggles in subordinate countries also imposed reform on local and international political regimes. Decades of revolutionary struggle, from the Chinese revolutions to Vietnam, and from the Cuban Revolution to the numerous liberation struggles throughout Latin America, Africa, and the Arab world, had pushed forward a proletarian wage demand that various socialist and/or nationalist reformist regimes had to satisfy, and that directly destabilized the international economic system. The ideology of modernization, even when it did not bring development, created new desires that exceeded the established relations of production and reproduction. The sudden increase in the cost of raw materials, energy, and certain agricultural commodities in the 1960s and 1970s was a symptom of these new desires and the rising pressure of the international proletariat on the wage. The effects of these struggles were not only a quantitative matter, but also determined a qualitatively new element that profoundly marked the intensity of the crisis. For more than 100 years, the practices of imperialism had worked to subsume all forms of production throughout the world under the command of capital, and that tendency was only intensified in this period of transition. The tendency created necessarily a potential or virtual unity of the international proletariat. This virtual unity was never fully actualized as a global political unity, but it, nonetheless, had substantial effects. In other words, the few instances of the actual and conscious international organization of labor are not what seem most important here, but rather the objective coincidence of struggles that overlap precisely because, despite their radical diversity, they were all directed against the international disciplinary regime of capital. The growing coincidence determined what we call an accumulation of struggles. This accumulation of struggles undermined the capitalist strategy that had long relied on the hierarchies of the international divisions of labor to block any global unity among workers. Already in the 19th century, before European imperialism had fully bloomed, Engels was bemoaning the fact that the English proletariat was put in the position of a labor aristocracy because its interests lay with the project of British imperialism rather than with the ranks of colonial labor power. In the period of the decline of imperialisms, strong international divisions of labor certainly remained, but the imperialist advantages of any national working class had begun to wither away. The common struggles of the proletariat in the subordinate countries took away the possibility of the old imperialist strategy of transferring the crisis from the metropolitan terrain to subordinate territories. It was no longer feasible to rely on Cecil Rhodes' old strategy of placating the domestic dangers of class struggle in Europe by shifting the economic pressures to the still peaceful order of the dominated imperialist terrain, maintained with brutally effective techniques. The proletariat formed on the imperialist terrain was now itself organized, armed, and dangerous. There was thus a tendency toward the unity of the international or multinational proletariat and one common attack against the capitalist disciplinary regime. The resistance and initiative of the proletariat in the subordinate countries resonated as a symbol and model both above and within the proletariat of the dominant capitalist countries. By virtue of this convergence, the workers' struggles throughout the domain of international capital already decreed the end of the division between first and third worlds, and the potential political integration of the entire global proletariat. The convergence of struggles posed on an international scale the problem of transforming laboring cooperation into revolutionary organization and actualizing the virtual political unity. With this objective convergence and accumulation of struggles, Third Worldist perspectives, which may earlier have had a limited utility, were now completely useless. We understand Third Worldism to be defined by the notion that the primary contradiction and antagonism of the international capitalist system is between the capital of the First World and the labor of the Third. The potential for revolution thus resides squarely and exclusively in the Third World. This view has been evoked implicitly and explicitly in a variety of dependency theories, theories of underdevelopment, and world system perspectives. The limited merit of the Third Worldist perspective was that it directly countered the First Worldist or Eurocentric view that innovation and change have always originated and can only originate in Euro-America. Its spectacular opposition of this false claim, however, leads only to a position that is equally false. We find this third worldist perspective inadequate because it ignores the innovations and antagonisms of labor in the first and second worlds. Furthermore, and most important for our argument here, the third worldist perspective is blind to the real convergence of struggles across the world, in the dominant and subordinate countries alike. Capitalist response to the crisis. As the global confluence of struggles undermine the capitalist and imperialist capacities of discipline, the economic order that had dominated the globe for almost 30 years, the golden age of U.S. hegemony and capitalist growth, began to unravel. The form and substance of the capitalist management of international development for the post-war period were dictated at the conference at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, in 1944. The Bretton Woods system was based on three fundamental elements. Its first characteristic was the comprehensive economic hegemony of the United States over all the non-socialist countries. This hegemony was secured through the strategic choice of a liberal development based on relatively free trade, and moreover by maintaining gold, of which the United States possessed about 1/3 of the world total, as a guarantee of the power of the dollar. The dollar was as good as gold. Second, the system demanded the agreement for monetary stabilization between the United States and the other dominant capitalist countries, first Europe, then Japan, over the traditional territories of European imperialisms, which had been dominated previously by the British pound and the French franc. Reform in the dominant capitalist countries could thus be financed by surplus of exports to the United States and guaranteed by the monetary system of the dollar. Finally, Bretton Woods dictated the establishment of a quasi-imperialist relationship with the United States over all the subordinate non-socialist countries. Economic development within the United States and stabilization and reform in Europe and Japan were all guaranteed by the United States insofar as it accumulated imperialist super profits through its relationship to the subordinate countries. The system of U.S. monetary hegemony was a fundamentally new arrangement because, whereas the control of previous international monetary systems, notably the British, had been firmly in the hands of private bankers and financiers, Bretton Woods gave control to a series of governmental and regulatory organizations, including the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and ultimately the U.S. Federal Reserve. Bretton Woods might thus be understood as a monetary and financial face of the hegemony of the New Deal model over the global capitalist economy. The Keynesian and pseudo-imperialist mechanisms of Bretton Woods eventually went into crisis when the continuity of the workers' struggles in the United States, Europe, and Japan raised the cost of stabilization and reformism, and when anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist struggles in subordinate countries began to undermine the extraction of super profits. When the imperialist motor could no longer move forward and the workers' struggles became ever more demanding, the U.S. trade balance began to lean heavily in the direction of Europe and Japan. A first phase of crisis, creeping rather than rampant, extended from the early to the late 1960s. Since the controls provided by Bretton Woods made the dollar de facto inconvertible, the monetary mediation of international production and trade developed through a phase characterized by the relatively free circulation of capital, the construction of a strong euro-dollar market, and the fixing of political parity more or less everywhere in the dominant countries. The explosion of 1968 in Europe, the United States, and Japan, coupled with the Vietnamese military victory of the United States, however, completely dissolved this provisory stabilization. Stagflation gave way to rampant inflation. The second phase of the crisis might be thought of as beginning on August 17, 1971, when President Nixon decoupled the dollar from the gold standard, making the dollar inconvertible de jure and adding a 10% surcharge to all imports from Europe to the United States. The entire U.S. debt was effectively pushed onto Europe. This operation was accomplished only by virtue of the economic and political power of the United States, which thus reminded the Europeans of the initial terms of the agreement, of its hegemony as the highest point of exploitation and capitalist command. In the 1970s, a crisis became official and structural. The system of political and economic equilibria invented at Bretton Woods had been completely thrown into disarray. and what remained was only the brute fact of U.S. hegemony. The declining effectiveness of the Bretton Woods mechanisms and the decomposition of the monetary system of Fordism in the dominant countries made it clear that the reconstruction of an international system of capital would have to involve a comprehensive restructuring of economic relations and a paradigm shift in the definition of world command. Such a crisis, however, is not always an entirely negative or unwelcome event from the perspective of capital. Marx claims that capital does indeed have a fundamental interest in economic crisis for its transformative power. With respect to the overall system, individual capitalists are conservative. They focus primarily on maximizing their individual profits in the short term, even when this leads down to a ruinous path for collective capital in the long term. Economic crisis can overcome these resistances, destroy unprofitable sectors, restructure the organization of production, and renew its technologies. In other words, economic crisis can push forward a transformation that reestablishes a high general rate of profit, thus responding effectively on the very terrain defined by the worker attack. Capital's general devaluation and its efforts to destroy worker organization serve to transform the substance of the crisis, the disequilibrium of circulation and overproduction, into a reorganized apparatus of command that rearticulates the relationship between development and exploitation. Given the intensity and coherence of the struggles in the 1960s and 1970s, two paths were open to capital for accomplishing the task of placating the struggles and restructuring command, and it tried each of them in turn. The first path, which had only a limited effectiveness, was the repressive option, a fundamentally conservative operation. Capital's repressive strategy was aimed at completely reversing the social process, separating and disaggregating the labor market, and reestablishing control over the entire cycle of production. Capital thus privileged the organizations that represented a guaranteed wage for a limited portion of the workforce, fixing that segment of the population within their structures, and reinforcing the separation between those workers and more marginalized populations. The reconstruction of a system of hierarchical compartmentalization, both within each nation and internationally, was accomplished by controlling social mobility and fluidity. The repressive use of technology, including the automation and computerization of production, was a central weapon wielded in this effort. The previous fundamental technological transformation in the history of capitalist production, that is, the introduction of the assembly line in the mass manufacturing regime, involved crucial modifications of the immediate productive process, Taylorism, and an enormous step forward in the regulation of the social cycle of reproduction, Fordism. The technological transformations in the 1970s, however, with their thrust toward automatic rationalization, pushed these regimes to the extreme limit of their effectiveness, to the breaking point. Taylorist and Fordist mechanisms could no longer control the dynamic of productive and social forces. Repression exercised of the old framework of control could perhaps keep a lid on the destructive powers of the crisis in the theory of the worker attack, but it was ultimately also a self-destructive response that would suffocate capitalist production itself. At the same time, then, a second path had to come into play, one that would involve a technological transformation aimed no longer only at repression, but rather at changing the very composition of the proletariat, and thus integrating, dominating, and profiting from its new practices and forms. In order to understand the emergence of the second path of capitalist response to the crisis, however, the path that constitutes a paradigm shift, we have to look beyond the immediate logic of capitalist strategy and planning. The history of capitalist forms is always necessarily a reactive history. Left to its own devices, capital would never abandon a regime of profit. In other words, capitalism undergoes systemic transformation only when it is forced to, and when its current regime is no longer tenable. In order to grasp the process from the perspective of its active element, we need to adopt the standpoint of the other side, that is, the standpoint of the proletariat, along with that of the remaining non-capitalist world that is progressively being drawn into capitalist relations. The power of the proletariat imposes limits on capital and not only determines the crisis, but also dictates the terms and nature of the transformation. The proletariat actually invents the social and productive forms that capital will be forced to adopt in the future. We can get a first hint of this determinant role of the proletariat by asking ourselves how, throughout the crisis, the United States was able to maintain its hegemony. The answer lies in part, perhaps paradoxically, not in the genius of U.S. politicians or capitalists, but in the power and creativity of the U.S. proletariat. Whereas earlier, from another perspective, we posed the Vietnamese resistance as a symbolic center of the struggles. Now, in terms of the paradigm shift of international capitalist command, the U.S. proletariat appears as a subjective figure that expressed most fully the desires and needs of international or multinational workers. Against the common wisdom that the U.S. proletariat is weak because of its low party and union representation with respect to Europe and elsewhere, perhaps we should see it as strong for precisely those reasons. Working class power resides not in the representative institutions, but in the antagonism and autonomy of the workers themselves. This is what marked the real power of the U.S. industrial working class. Moreover, the creativity and the conflictuality of the proletariat resided also, and perhaps more important, in the laboring populations outside the factories. Even, and especially, those who actively refused work posed serious threats and creative alternatives. In order to understand the continuation of U.S. hegemony, then, it is not sufficient to cite the relations of force that U.S. capitalism wielded over the capitalists in other countries. U.S. hegemony was actually sustained by the antagonistic power of the U.S. proletariat. The new hegemony that seemed to remain in the hands of the United States was still limited at this point, closed within the old mechanisms of disciplinary restructuring. A paradigm shift was needed to design the restructuring process along the lines of the political and technological shift. In other words, capital had to confront and respond to the new production of subjectivity of the proletariat. This new production of subjectivity reached, beyond the struggle over welfare, which we have already mentioned, what might be called an ecological struggle, a struggle over the mode of life that was eventually expressed in the developments of immaterial labor. The ecology of capital. We are still not yet in a position to understand the nature of the second path of capital's response to the crisis, the paradigm shift that will move it beyond the logics and practices of disciplinary modernization. We need to step back once again and examine the limitations imposed on capital by the international proletariat and the non-capitalist environment that both made the transformation necessary and dictated its terms. At the time of the First World War, it seemed to many observers, and particularly to the Marxist theorists of imperialism, that the death knell had sounded and capital had reached the threshold of fatal disaster. Capitalism had pursued decades-long crusades of expansion, used up significant portions of the globe for its accumulation, and for the first time, been forced to confront the limits of its frontiers. As these limits approached, imperialist powers inevitably found themselves in mortal conflict with one another. Capital depended on its outside, as Rosa Luxemburg said, on its non-capitalist environment, in order to realize and capitalize its surplus value, and thus continue its cycles of accumulation. In the early 20th century, it appeared that the imperialist adventures of capitalist accumulation would soon deplete the surrounding non-capitalist nature, and capital would starve to death. Everything outside the capitalist relation, be it human, animal, vegetable, or mineral, was seen from the perspective of capital and its expansion as nature. The critique of capitalist imperialism thus expressed an ecological consciousness. Ecological precisely insofar as it recognized the real limits of nature and the catastrophic consequences of its destruction. Well, as we write this book, and the 20th century draws to a close, capitalism is miraculously healthy, its accumulation more robust than ever. How can we reconcile this fact with the careful analyses of numerous Marxist authors at the beginning of the century who pointed to the imperialist conflicts as symptoms of an impending ecological disaster running up against the limits of nature? There are three ways we might approach this mystery of capital's continuing health. First, some claim that capital is no longer imperialist, that it has reformed, turned back the clock to its salad days of free competition, and developed a conservationist, ecological relationship with its non-capitalist environment. Even if theorists from Marx to Luxemburg had not demonstrated that such a process runs counter to the essence of capitalist accumulation itself, merely a cursory glance at contemporary global political economy should persuade anyone to dismiss this explanation out of hand. It is quite clear that capitalist expansion continued at an increasing pace in the latter half of the 20th century, opening new territories to the capitalist market and subsuming non-capitalist productive processes under the rule of capital. A second hypothesis might be that the unforeseen persistence of capitalism involves simply a continuation of the same processes of expansion and accumulation that we analyzed earlier, only that the complete depletion of the environment was not yet imminent, and that the moment of confronting limits and of ecological disaster was still to come. The global resources of the non-capitalist environment have indeed proved to be vast. Although the so-called Green Revolution has subsumed within capitalism a large portion of the world's non-capitalist agriculture, and other modernization projects have incorporated new territories and civilizations into the cycle of capitalist accumulation, there still remain enormous, if of course limited, basins of labor power and material resources to be subsumed in capitalist production and potential sites for expanding markets. For example, the collapse of the socialist regimes in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, along with the opening of the Chinese economy in the post-Mao era, has provided global capital access to huge territories of non-capitalist environment, prefabricated for capitalist subsumption by years of socialist modernization. Even in regions already securely integrated into the world capitalist system, there are still ample opportunities for expansion. In other words, according to this second hypothesis, non-capitalist environments continue to be subsumed formally under capital's domain, and thus accumulation can still function, at least in part, through this formal subsumption. The prophets of capital's imminent doom were not wrong, but merely spoke too early. The limitations of the non-capitalist environment, however, are real. Sooner or later, the once abundant resources of nature will run out. A third hypothesis, which may be seen as complementary to the second, is that today, capital continues to accumulate through subsumption in a cycle of expanded reproduction, but that increasingly it subsumes not the non-capitalist environment, but its own capitalist terrain. That is, that the subsumption is no longer formal but real. Capital no longer looks outside, but rather inside its domain, and its expansion is thus intensive rather than extensive. This passage centers on a qualitative leap in the technological organization of capital. Previous stages of the Industrial Revolution introduced machine-made consumer goods, and then machine-made machines. But now we find ourselves confronted with machine-made raw materials and foodstuffs. In short, machine-made nature and machine-made culture. We might say then, following Friedrich Jameson, that post-modernization is the economic process that emerges when mechanical and industrial technologies have expanded to invest the entire world, when the modernization process is complete, and when the formal subsumption of the non-capitalist environment has reached its limit. Through the processes of modern technological transformation, all of nature has become capital, or at least has become subject to capital, whereas modern accumulation is based on the formal subsumption of the non-capitalist environment. Postmodern accumulation relies on the real subsumption of the capitalist terrain itself. This seems to be the real capitalist response to the threat of ecological disaster, a response that looks to the future. The completion of the industrialization of society and nature, however, the completion of modernization, poses only the precondition for the passage to postmodernization and grasps the transformation only in negative terms, as post. In the next section, we will confront directly the real process of postmodernization, or the informatization of production. Assault on the disciplinary regime. To understand this passage more deeply, we have to touch somehow on its determinate foundation, which resides in the subjective transformations of labor power. In the period of crisis, throughout the 1960s and 1970s, the expansion of welfare and the universalization of discipline in both the dominant and the subordinate countries created a new margin of freedom for the laboring multitude. In other words, workers made use of the disciplinary era, and above all, its moments of dissent and its phases of political destabilization. such as the period of the Vietnam crisis, in order to expand the social powers of labor, increase the value of labor power, and redesign the set of needs and desires to which the wage and welfare had to respond. In Marxist terminology, one would say that the value of necessary labor had risen enormously, and of course, most important from the perspective of capital, as necessary labor time increases, surplus labor time, and hence profit, decreases correspondingly. From the standpoint of the capitalist, the value of necessary labor appears as an objective economic quantity. The price of labor power, like the price of grain, oil, and other commodities, but really it is determined socially and as the index of a whole series of social struggles. The definition of the set of social needs, the quality of the time of non-work, the organization of family relationships, the accepted expectations of life are all in play and effectively represented by the cost of reproducing the worker. The enormous rise in the social wage, in terms of both working wages and welfare, during the period of the crisis in the 1960s and 1970s, resulted directly from the accumulation of social struggles on the terrain of reproduction, the terrain of non-work, the terrain of life. The social struggles not only raised the cost of reproduction and the social wage, hence decreasing the rate of profit, but also, and more important, forced a change in the quality and nature of labor itself, particularly in the dominant capitalist countries, where the margin of freedom afforded to and won by workers was greatest. The refusal of the disciplinary regime of the social factory was accompanied by a reevaluation of the social value of the entire set of productive activities. The disciplinary regime clearly no longer succeeded in containing the needs and desires of young people. The prospect of getting a job that guarantees regular and stable work for 8 hours a day, 50 weeks a year, for an entire working life, the prospect of entering the normalized regime of the social factory, which had been a dream for many of their parents, now appears a kind of death. The mass refusal of disciplinary regime, which took a variety of forms, was not only a negative expression, but also a moment of creation, what Nietzsche calls a transvaluation of values. The various forms of social contestation and experimentation all centered on a refusal to value the kind of fixed program of material production typical of the disciplinary regime, its mass factories, and its nuclear family structure. The movements valued instead a more flexible dynamic of creativity and what might be considered more immaterial forms of production. From the standpoint of traditional political segments of the U.S. movements in the 1960s, the various forms of cultural experimentation that blossomed with a vengeance during that period all appeared as a kind of distraction from the real political and economic struggles. But what they failed to see was that the merely cultural experimentation had very profound political and economic effects. Dropping out was really a poor conception of what was going on in Haight-Ashbury and across the United States in the 1960s. The two essential operations were the refusal of the disciplinary regime and the experimentation with new forms of productivity. The refusal appeared in a wide variety of guises and proliferated in thousands of daily practices. It was the college student who experimented with LSD instead of looking for a job. It was the young woman who refused to get married and make a family. It was a shiftless African-American worker who moved on CP, colored people's time, refusing work in every way possible. The youth who refused the deadening repetition of the factory society invented new forms of mobility and flexibility, new styles of living. Student movements forced a high social value to be accorded to knowledge and intellectual labor. Feminist movements that made clear the political content of personal relationships and refused patriarchal discipline raised the social value of what has traditionally been considered women's work, which involves a high content of effective or caring labor and centers on services necessary for social reproduction. The entire panoply of movements and the entire emerging counterculture highlighted the social value of cooperation and communication. This massive transvaluation of the values of social production and production of new subjectivities opened the way for a powerful transformation of labor power. In the next section, we will see in detail how the indexes of the value of the movements, mobility, flexibility, knowledge, communication, cooperation, the effective, would define the transformation of capitalist production in the subsequent decades. The various analyses of new social movements have done a great service in insisting on the political importance of cultural movements against narrowly economic perspectives that minimize their significance. These analyses, however, are extremely limited themselves because, just like the perspectives they oppose, they perpetuate narrow understandings of the economic and the cultural. Most important, they fail to recognize the profound economic power of the cultural movements, or really, the increasing indistinguishability of economic and cultural phenomena. On the one hand, capitalist relations were expanding to subsume all aspects of social production and reproduction, the entire realm of life, and on the other hand, cultural relations were redefining production processes and economic structures of value. A regime of production, and above all a regime of the production of subjectivity, was being destroyed, and another invented by the enormous accumulation of struggles. These new circuits of the production of subjectivity, which were centered on the dramatic modifications of value and labor, were realized within and against the final period of the disciplinary organization of society. The movements anticipated the capitalist awareness of a need for a paradigm shift in production and dictated its form and nature. If the Vietnam War had not taken place, if there had not been worker and student revolts in the 1960s, if there had not been 1968 and the second wave of the women's movements, if there had not been the whole series of anti-imperialist struggles, capital would have been content to maintain its own arrangement of power, happy to have been saved the trouble of shifting the paradigm of production. It would have been content for several good reasons. Because the natural limits of development served it well, because it was threatened by the development of immaterial labor, because it knew that the transversal mobility and hybridization of world labor power opened the potential for new crises and class conflicts in an order never before experienced. The restructuring of production from Fordism to post-Fordism, from modernization to post-modernization, was anticipated by the rise of a new subjectivity. The passage from the phase of perfecting the disciplinary regime to the successive phase of shifting the productive paradigm was driven from below, by a proletariat whose composition had already changed. Capital did not need to invent a new paradigm, even if it were capable of doing so, because a truly creative moment had already taken place. Capital's problem was rather to dominate a new composition that had already been produced autonomously and defined within a new relationship to nature and labor, a relationship of autonomous production. At this point, the disciplinary system has become completely obsolete and must be left behind. Capital must accomplish a negative mirroring and an inversion of the new quality of labor power. It must adjust itself so as to be able to command once again. We suspect that for this reason, the industrial and political forces that have relied most heavily and with the most intelligence on the extreme modernization of the disciplinary productive model, such as the major elements of Japanese and East Asian capital, are the ones that will suffer most severely in this passage. The only configurations of capital able to thrive in the new world will be those that adapt to and govern the new immaterial, cooperative, communicative, and effective composition of labor power. The death throes of Soviet discipline. Now that we have given a first approximation to the conditions and forms of the new paradigm, we want to examine briefly one gigantic subjective effect that the paradigm shift determined in the course of its movement: the collapse of the Soviet system. Our thesis, which we share with many scholars of the Soviet world, is that the system went into crisis and fell apart because of its structural incapacity to go beyond the model of disciplinary governability with respect to both its mode of production, which was Fordist and Taylorist, and its form of political command, which was Keynesian socialist, and thus simply modernizing internally and imperialist externally. This lack of flexibility in adapting its deployment of command and its productive apparatus to the changes of labor power exacerbated the difficulties of the transformation. The heavy bureaucracy of the Soviet state, inherited from a long period of intense modernization, placed Soviet power in an impossible position when it had to react to the new demands and desires that the globally emerging subjectivities expressed, first within the process of modernization, and then at its outer limits. The challenge of postmodernity was posed primarily not by the enemy powers, but by the new subjectivity of labor power and its new intellectual and communicative composition. The regime, particularly in its illiberal aspects, was unable to respond adequately to these subjective demands. The system could have continued, and for a certain period did continue, to work on the basis of the model of disciplinary modernization, but it could not combine modernization with the new mobility and creativity of labor power, the fundamental conditions for breathing life into the new paradigm and its complex mechanisms. In the context of Star Wars, the nuclear arms race, and space exploration, the Soviet Union may still have been able to keep up with its adversaries from the technological and military point of view, but the system could not manage to sustain the competitive conflict on the subjective front. It could not compete, in other words, precisely where the real power conflicts were being played out, and it could not face the challenges of the comparative productivity of economic systems. Because advanced technologies of communication and cybernetics are efficient only when they are rooted in subjectivity, or better, when they are animated by productive subjectivities. For the Soviet regime, managing the power of the new subjectivities was a matter of life and death. According to our thesis, then, after the dramatic final years of Stalin's rule and Khrushchev's abortive innovations, Brezhnev's regime imposed a freeze on a productive civil society that had reached a higher level of maturity and that, after the enormous mobilizations for war and productivity, was asking for social and political recognition. In the capitalist world, the massive Cold War propaganda and the extraordinary ideological machine of falsification and misinformation prevented us from seeing the real development in Soviet society and the political dialectics that unfolded there. Cold War ideology called that society totalitarian, but in fact, it was a society crisscrossed by extremely strong instances of creativity and freedom, just as strong as the rhythms of economic development and cultural modernization. The Soviet Union was better understood not as a totalitarian society, but rather as a bureaucratic dictatorship. And only if we leave these distorted definitions behind can we see how political crisis was produced and reproduced in the Soviet Union, to the point finally of burying the regime. Resistance to the bureaucratic dictatorship is what drove the crisis. The Soviet proletariat's refusal of work was in fact the very same method of struggle that the proletariat in the capitalist countries deployed, forcing their governments into a cycle of crisis, reform, and restructuring. This is our point. Despite the delays of development of Russian capitalism, despite the massive losses in World War II, despite the relative cultural isolation, the relative exclusion from the world market, the cruel policies of imprisonment, starvation, and murder of the population, despite all this, and despite their enormous differences with the dominant capitalist countries, the proletariat in Russia and the other countries of the Soviet bloc managed by the 1960s and 1970s to pose the very same problems as the proletariat in the capitalist countries. Even in Russia and the other countries under Soviet control, the demand for higher wages and greater freedom grew continuously along with the rhythm of modernization. And, just as in the capitalist countries, there was defined a new figure of labor power, which now expressed enormous productive capacities on the basis of a new development of the intellectual powers of production. This new productive reality, this living intellectual multitude, is what the Soviet leaders tried to lock in the cages of a disciplinary war economy, a war that was continuously conjured up rhetorically, and corral in the structure of a socialist ideology of labor and economic development, that is, a socialist management of capital that no longer made any sense. The Soviet bureaucracy was not able to construct the armory necessary for the postmodern mobilization of the new labor power. It was frightened by it, terrorized by the collapse of disciplinary regimes, by the transformations that tailorized and forwarded subjects that had previously animated production. This was the point where the crisis became irreversible, and, given the immobility of the Brezhnevian hibernation, catastrophic. What we find important was not so much the lack of, or the offenses against the individual and formal freedoms of workers, but rather the waste of the productive energy of a multitude that had exhausted the potential of modernity and now wanted to be liberated from the socialist management of capitalist accumulation in order to express a higher level of productivity. This repression and this energy were the forces that, from opposite sides, made the Soviet world collapse like a house of cards. Glasnost and perestroika certainly did represent a soft criticism of Soviet power and posed the necessity of a democratic passage as a condition for a renewed productivity of the system, but they were employed too late and too timidly to stop the crisis. The Soviet machine turned in on itself and ground to a halt, without the fuel that only new productive subjectivities can produce. The sectors of intellectual and immaterial labor withdrew their consensus from the regime, and their exodus condemned the system to death. Death from the socialist victory of modernization, death from the incapacity to use its effects and surpluses, death from a definitive asphyxia that strangled the subjective conditions which demanded a passage to post-modernity.